So, good afternoon. Good 12 noon to you. Hi, Larry.
Hey.
This is John Firth, and we're going to be talking today about what keeps a CEO up more at night. Is it customers or is it employees? And I've actually asked a couple or gotten into the conversation with a few clients, and believe it or not, they don't really have an answer. But I think we have some pretty good ideas and maybe even an answer for you. Larry, anything you want to say to introduce yourself really quickly?
Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation and inviting me along today. And I appreciate it. I really look forward to this because I've had many conversations this week with CEOs and with business owners concerning this. So I think it's a great topic to talk about, especially when we're hitting an environment of turmoil in the economy. So let's continue. Let's go, John. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're gonna start with this. Larry's gonna talk a little bit about the importance of customer centricity, but then I'm gonna take another way of looking at it based on my experience with quite a number of clients. So, Larry, I think everybody agrees that organizations that don't know their customers or clients or consumers often get into trouble. They miss the marketplace. They spend money on products that nobody wants, and so forth. And we have tons of examples of firms that have wiped out. Tell me your view of customer centricity.
So, every business needs to be every business needs to be involved with their employees and keep their employees happy and get that engagement going. To work on the vision, to work on the spirit of the company. But at the end of the day, we have to worry about our customers and where our customers are. Customers will help us through a lot. Customer centricity is a customer journey, right? So what the customer journey becomes paramount in the lifeline of a business and in attracting and maintaining and growing a business. So when we put our heads down at night to what keeps us awake, it's when we open the doors the next morning. We believe we have our team together and ready to perform, but then who walks through the door is the customer centricity. And the part that I think if you build a they will come, well, are they coming? So that's why I see that the centricity is in the customer corner, because you've built it and you have your business going. You want people to come in.
Mm-hmm. So. And interestingly enough, one of the statistics that I throw around is about 70% of all startups fail in the first 2 years, and the number one reason is wrong product for the marketplace. In other words, they haven't really figured out, first of all, who their customer base is, second of all, what they want, and then what it is that they're going to do to fulfill that need or desire. So even in startup phase, or especially in startup phase, the product piece is important, knowing your customers. But even later, we look at companies like IBM that completely missed the ball and went into tailspin and then was revived by Gerstner. We see other companies that hit it right on the market, and Apple that just keeps doing it over and over and over again in very innovative ways. So you see examples along the way. When I was at Sony, Sony had big hits and big disasters. And one of the things that we thought was an issue at Sony, at least me, I was in corporate in Tokyo, was that the Japanese really didn't listen to the other countries, to the rest of the world, and America and the United States being their most important foreign market. There was this constant source of frustration for the American managers and heads of business lines that the Japanese didn't really talk to them or take seriously their input and so forth. And it was always, frightening because we never knew when a product came out if it was actually going to get traction in the USA. And there were a couple of very pissed off heads of the US businesses because of that. And there were some notable disasters. VHS Betamax issue was probably one of the bigger ones, but there were many. But let's talk for a second about employees. Now, if I take the other way of looking at it, you know, we spend a lot of time worrying about employees. And what I've discovered with my people, where we're dealing with all sorts of issues, the people I coach in my Vistage group, my private clients, is I was thinking last night that if I really went through it, who focused very much on customers and were kind of almost hyper aware or always feeling they didn't have enough, they needed to get more, as opposed to those who really thought about the employees and was always worried about employees being happy enough that they'd stay and not be taken from, go to competitors or have headhunters swarming around them. I found those that worried more about their employees actually did better. They grew their companies faster, they were stronger, they were more sustainable. Now, these are small companies. So I come back to this thing about startup phase. When you're small, there's that moment where you can't obsess about customers that much. And you need to really worry about your employees because your employees are the face to the customers. But that's just in my experience. What about you? What have you seen?
So there's an interesting dichotomy. So a lot of times you have business owners who, and it really depends on the DNA and the culture that the business owner is going to throw into their business, right? So if the DNA develops the employees, then that's not going to keep them up at night, right? So if they focus on their employees and they get their employees in line and they get them enrolled in everything and they get them engaged, there's less of a chance that they're going to leave you. And there's a better chance that they're on your mission, they're aligned with what you're doing, and you're going to be able to go forward. So that's why I shift towards like, well, there's the whole customer journey, but I'm going to go back to the employees. So when I do have some business owners who are don't have the DNA of engagement with their team, or there's something with their team that's off a little bit, they stay awake at night wondering who's coming to work the next day, right? So, but I think in part the conversation we're having depends not even on the company or the type of business, but on the owner's DNA and the culture that they pre-offer to their business when they're in the startup. Mm-hmm. Right. So if they enroll everyone, it's going to be a lot easier and less of a worry. But if they don't, then they are worried who's going to show up on Saturday when I have it or on Friday. And I know I have a trade show coming and is someone going to take my best salesman away. So I almost point to the CEO or the hiring manager, the C level of a company to say, hey, guys, where's your focus to start? What have you built? What's your culture? And then that will determine really a lot of what your worry is.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I was talking to another coach yesterday who was talking about the EOS system and how it's a little bit of a cookbook, but it's the fundamentals, it's culture, it's values, it's mission, all those wonderful things or that really drive an organization. And the way he talked about it is nobody creative, nobody really enjoys business, wants to work from a cookbook. But he said it does make it very clear if those things are not in place, you're going to run into problems all the time. But again, now I'm going to talk on the other side about customers. First of all, there's the fact that without customers, you have no business.
But I want to go back. So they have a cookbook, but everyone has their own recipe, and what they determine is the best recipe and what tastes best. Right. And that's sort of where I come back to the DNA. You're right. You can standardize all this stuff, and I am a big proponent of making sure you write it down so that people know, so that there is a clear focus. So I love recipes. That if you have the wrong recipe, it might not taste so good.
All right, that's a good way of looking at it. Or if you get the recipe and you don't measure it properly, as we know when you bake, if you put 2 cups of sugar instead of 1, something's going to go wrong somewhere along the way.
Agreed.
But actually, let's stay on the employee for a second. So the other thing is, I think why I constantly think it might be the customer. It's the customer that the CEO worries about, not the customer, the employees. It's because he's hired or she's hired people to worry about the customer. So that if they know how to hire, i.e., know how to get the right employees, then they can actually, because the CEO has to be able to do this, delegate a lot of that worry to the customers in terms of the actual worrying. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what is it that keeps people up at night? It's usually an issue that they can't find a solution to. Now, if they're having a problem with customers and their marketing folks and the product folks and what have you aren't doing that job, yeah, they're going to start worrying. But I bet you $1 million, because I was there too, I worried less as a CEO about the customers, because it was more like, why are my employees not doing their job? And why aren't we getting where we're supposed to be when that's their job? Now, you can also make bad hires. And it's, again, IBM with Lou Gerstner, he walked in a situation where everything was a mess. The strategy, which is kind of really the customer focused, you have to be constantly aware of the market to build your roadmap and to implement a strategy. That was all over the place. But it was also badly organized, and there was a culture problem, and he ended up firing 25% of the employees.
Yeah. So I get that. What I found, because I've worked mostly in businesses under 60 or 70 million dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So the founder, the CEO have commonly been the one with the pixie dust that knows how to bring the customers in and then hires people behind them. So delegating the customer relationship to the hired help, if you will, to your team member.
Right.
You're right. If you don't do it wisely, you're in a bad way. But usually those entrepreneurs have their finger on the pulse of the customer more than they have the finger on the pulse of their employee, because they feel that they could be the employee on some level. If they needed to step in and call the C-level exec of their customers and to get involved and to get deep in. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but that's why I focus on the customers. The employees they hire, even if they make a bad hire, that usually the C-level suite can go in and help, right?
Or make some changes. Actually, that's a really interesting point in terms of, it always comes back to who keeps the CEO up most. Yeah. If a CEO, a friend of mine said, because I think all of us go through a phase where we can't fire without like lots of holding on and nervous making, especially as entrepreneurs who have to fire their best friends, which happens quite a lot. A headhunter friend of mine said the key to the country club of CEOs is being able to fire. So if your CEO understands the equation of hiring right, training properly, and then separating when necessary, plus the retention part, they shouldn't have to worry about it so much. And I think you're also right that there are a lot of charismatic leaders, for lack of a better word, entrepreneurs, who just know what to say to customers, and customers flock to them and so forth. And they're usually the ones that you have to spend a lot of time with on the people stuff. Right? They just don't seem to be able to get that people are not product, that they have to be treated like people. Those people spend a lot of time worrying about the customer. But as I said, my experience has been, if they don't get ahead of sales or however they're going to structure it quickly, that means within a few months of starting to work with me, it's just, I wouldn't say vicious circle downward, but it doesn't go well. The CEOs have to be able to hire the people that he can delegate all his relationships to, and then understand when he's supposed to show up. And that's not easy. I don't know what your experience has been.
No,
that's not easy.
It's not easy, but you're also talking, the avatar CEO that you just described doesn't have his eye on his employees.
I know that's one of the problems.
Yeah. And that's why he doesn't go to, that's why it doesn't keep him up at night, right? Because it's like no harm, no foul. He doesn't know the what's behind him in the wake. And I do have clients like that who don't realize that behind them there's a wake of destruction, of not happy people. There's a high turnover. There's lack of dedication. But they're looking ahead and they're focused so customer centric.
Right.
They should be thinking more about their clients and their customers.
And that's an important transition. And I actually have the opposite experience. Is though most of the people I work with, it's so glaringly obvious to them that they've made some huge mistakes in their people. I had one client who was showing up on Glassdoor. He was getting devastated, ripped apart by former employees on Glassdoor, and he was very upset. But he was very product focused and very customer focused. And he really dug in. He knew there was a problem. And I was able to help him so that he began to understand, again, look at employees like human beings and not as something that you throw at a client. In his case, it was a service business. And that was his major turning point. When he got that, the business just took off. And but he always had a good head of sales. But boy, did he wrestle with it. I don't know if I have a client, if I've ever had a client who, the only time I think that they get caught surprised and they should have worried about it is when customers steal money. And that's happened a number of times to clients that they were blissfully unaware, but that was less of an employee issue and more of a structural control, financial controls. But that actually kept them up at night a lot too.
Well, I mean, but then it is an employee issue because it's not the control stealing the money.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, just changing it a tiny bit, is what do you think bothers a CEO, and what bothered you when you were a CEO more, losing a big client, or if you were doing project work as I was, a client having no follow-up work, or losing a key employee? Which kept you more up at night?
Oh, wow. I don't know. That's it. That's a really great question. I think there was some key employees that would have, that if I lost them would have devastated me. Obviously, there's a lot of people out there and there are a lot of customers out there, but the phase of business, you go through phases where you don't have challenges with your client base, but you have fulfillment challenges. You need employees. Right. So at that point, obviously the scale is going to tilt towards the employees. And then the inverse is, well, if your customers are leaving you, or if there's a down cycle, or if there's just a slow season, you need more. They say sales, fixes a lot of mistakes. So I think customers will be my final answer, if you will, because sales does fix it. Sales will allow you to hire your next hire, even pay more if you need to. If you don't have sales, the blood is gone.
That's interesting, because I think where we're trending is that there's certain cycles where customers are more important, employees are more important. Now, I was a strategy consultant running the U.S. business for a German consulting company, Strategy, very high-end, CEO-oriented. That business gets devastated every time a recession comes. I always said we were the canary in the mine shaft. We were the first ones who felt the recession was coming. The IT folks, technology folks, were the last, because they had big budgets, big projects that would, if it was going to get wound down, you can turn a strategy consultant pretty much off from one day to another. It's hard to turn a whole IT project off at once.
Okay.
So we would just totally suffer. And COVID, for me at least, my coaching business was not easy. And now I don't have employees, but the thing that got me, and also in the other periods when I first started and couldn't understand what was going on, is it makes my life miserable, because you can't figure out what has to happen. You're stuck in the middle of a recession or COVID. I mean, throwing crap against the wall, seeing it would stick. you're second guessing yourself. And I think in those cases, yeah, I became obsessive about what the hell am I going to do with my customers, the ones that I needed to have stay, and the ones that I had to let go because I just couldn't figure out how to keep them.
Right.
You know, and there are all sorts of McKinsey often would start doing free projects for the customers just to stay there. And at that point, you know, it's fairly easy, painful but easy, which is, you know, I've had to fire people. I've had to fire people who I had just hired because of a recession that came 2007, 2008. I had to rescind all the offers we had made to young associates because the business went like that.
Right. So what kept you up then?
What kept me up there was really, I think, you know, we're using this metaphorically, but when you are doing everything that worked beforehand and a lot of it isn't, and you're not getting the kind of feedback that allows you to think through it differently. Now, I worked at this German consulting company, and the head of it, Roland Berger, was a very smart man. And when we were about to hit a recession in the beginning of the 90s, he shifted a lot of what his company did, consulting, to restructuring. So he balanced the strategy consulting with restructuring and cost containment, all the things that companies, if they don't need, they at least think they need during a recession. So he diversified the portfolio. But he was obsessive about customers and not an awesome people manager, to be honest. He was an example of a man who was obsessed about customers day and night. That's all he talked about. And he was highly successful, and the company was very successful to a point.
So, you know, in part, that's sort of why when we spoke pre going live, I said, I'll take the customer side because we are hitting a time of inflationary pressures, turmoil, if you will.
Right.
We have to assume, or I like to believe, that the business owner, the CEO, has their team on board and they're engaged. Over the past 2 years, they've been engaged. They are keeping engagement. They are having conversations. They're keeping them enrolled in their missions and what they're doing. They're sharing what their new visions are as COVID's shifted. Their visions have shifted and that they're in line. And then comes the customer, because not everyone's able to write. I spoke with the CEO right before this morning, and he said, you know, not everyone could raise prices. And I'm like, have you been to the grocery store? He says, well, that's different, which it is. But he says, they're getting pushback. A lot of businesses are getting pushback on the price increases, saying you just can't do that to me, right? There's enough going on intrinsically, especially with labor going up in price, that you just can't do that. So that's when you have to look and say, okay, so I paid for the labor. Now, how am I going to pay for the labor? Right. And that's where the customer centricity comes in.
And even more so right now, it's very, very funky because, and it's not the first time it's funky, but we're in a talent shortage. Now we should probably talk about sectors because sectors have different issues. In the technology and consulting world where I live, or where I spend a lot of my time and most of my clients are in, there is a labor shortage of really good people. There's, you need really highly trained, highly motivated, hardworking people. And let's face it, there's a limited supply of that. And so for them, they're in the middle of the talent war right now. But you see this thing coming towards us. And now with the invasion of Ukraine and the stock market starting to tumble. And by the way, a lot of economists said we would face a recession in 2020 at the end of 2022. So that's 7 or 8 months away. And the stock market is always forward looking. I'm not really quite sure how some of these companies are going to fare. They might fare better because there'll be more talent on the street. But a lot of them weathered COVID and actually grew their customer bases. So it's I'm not entirely sure what these sectors are going to look like in terms of talent or worrying about the employees or worrying about customers. Because strangely enough, in COVID, they didn't. On the other hand, anybody who's doing anything live, restaurants, events, and so forth, were devastated in COVID. and they just had to, they got money from the government, thank God. They worried a lot about their employees only because they had not enough work. They were able to pay them, but their concern was, are these employees getting what they want? Because let's face it, good employees want to grow, they want to learn, they want to be part of something that's cool and doing stuff. And when you're not doing any stuff, it's hard to keep an employee motivated. So that was my clients who were in that space. Kind of, it was balanced. It was, it was like everything was crashing and burning on all sides. So they were worrying about everything.
No, absolutely. And yeah, hospitality was massacred. Actually, it's and they're still licking their wounds. We also live in the Northeast, where we had stronger lockdowns, and we've had a lot. Our businesses in the Northeast corridor were a lot more affected by the past 2 years than some of the other businesses throughout the country. Florida opened up early, and some countries, some states out west, or not countries, some states out west did. So, it is geographical as well. And yeah, I don't know what, I don't know where we're going to land at the end of the year, because we are in turmoil, because we just shifted a little bit to the economy. The economy is going to drive a lot of what will a business owner worry about? Are they going to all of a sudden say, my business is turning soft, I don't need as many people.
Right. And I doubt there's going to be emergency funds available for them this time around. Pandemic was literally, last one was exactly over 100 years ago, last pandemic. And that was extreme measures. I mean, I actually think for once the government did the right thing, because I don't know what would have happened to the world had there not been government money flowing into people's pockets who otherwise would have no income. And even now, we might as well move to a subject that's related. What you and I started talking about was the general weirdness of how people are feeling right now. Yeah. I've had multiple conversations, less with my clients, but with friends or fellow coaches, like the gentleman yesterday, who's just kind of at a loss right now. Yeah.
There are businesses that are they are at a loss. They're like, I have a supply chain. I don't know where my next shipment's coming. I don't know when my next shipment's coming. My customers are going to my competitors because my competitors might have the product. Their customers are coming to me because I might have the product. So instead of me having 100 products, I have 70. So I'm only getting a percentage of the business that I should be getting. I used to send in a PO to a vendor, and I would wait for the delivery date and follow it up. But now I have to send 8 emails, 9 emails, 10 emails, and then am I going to get it or am I not going to get it? So there are a lot of stresses coming from a lot of places right now, and the geopolitics is just I think for me, the people that I spoke to this week are extraordinarily concerned about the geopolitical situation. Globally, right? Yeah. So what happened in Canada, with all of a sudden the government taking these emergency measures for seemingly no reason, and then taking people's money and just grabbing their bank accounts, and no courts, no nothing, no due process, and they're just saying, yeah, we don't like who you donated money to, you're out of here, we're taking your money until we figure out if you're a good or bad person, is a freak out.
It's a total freak out.
A total freak out. So when I spoke with another CEO this morning in our conversation from FinTech, and we were discussing this, it was like the thing when I did business globally was that I always wondered, why was the U.S. such a great place to be able for businesses to thrive so well versus all the others? I was in Europe, I was in Far East, and the answer in the end became, because we have this thing called property rights. Rule of law, and those seem to be the determining factors of where people would park their money and invest their money. If all of a sudden we lose that simple principle, then there's challenges, and that's the uneasy feeling that people are getting now. It's like, well, I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, do you think there's a chance of us losing some of those property rights, or?
Oh, there's no. It's already started. I have a. Sadly, yes. We have a half sentient president who doesn't really know. He doesn't put sentences together well. He's not really on top of it. And what's happening and who he's bringing into the government are guys who are basically not for the rule of law and free speech. And like, there's a lot going on. And it really affects the business over. It affects the CEO. It creates an instability where there used to be stability. If life wasn't tough enough with the pandemic, if life wasn't tough enough with the inflation from the pandemic, now we're left with people who want to shift the political the politics and how we live every day. And we are a representative democracy with property rights and the rule of law. And when we lose that, businesses get scared, investors get scared, and it is not good.
Yeah, well, look what happened in Russia and China. Now, both of them have come back really strong, but it's because they loosened the reins and allowed property ownership, allowed entrepreneurial activities, private ownership. Otherwise, 20 years ago, well, we know what happened 25 years ago. The whole thing just crashed and burned, although there were a lot of reasons for it. But in the wake of that crash and burn, they loosened the restriction or the hold that the state had on anything economic that was going on. And that's what turned them into the powerhouses they are now. I mean, who would have thought that we'd have Russia and China coming together as a global force against the rest of us?
So China doesn't have property rights.
Yeah, well, it allows a lot of entrepreneurial activities.
Yeah.
And I do believe with that, they get certain ownership rights.
No, they 99-year leases is the best you can do.
Oh, okay. Well, that's always been, I mean, Hong Kong was a 99-year lease.
They're not getting that much. And it's a little more, it's challenging. You still have local governments that strong arm you in, or you have the local party that wants their share, and you have tax collectors collecting above and beyond the tax rate. So, that hopefully is not where we'll be. I think just the thought of the instability of what's happened is the concern that I've been feeling this week. That was a big deal what happened in China. It's basically, in Canada. It's basically tyranny. And for one person to be able to say, I don't like that ideology, and therefore anyone who believes that is going to be financially punished, and we're going to take their property and treasure from them is a concern.
It's pretty horrific if you think about it. I mean, can you imagine that happening in the United States? I mean, in small doses, it does. There's this fine line between criminals. And I'm watching the show Billions. It's interesting because we're now talking about the other things that keep CEOs up.
This is really what's keeping them up.
Yeah, and it really is interesting. I'm going back to my days and also thinking about my clients. It's interesting because small businesses have more of a problem, I think, digesting global events and what it means for them, as opposed to the CEO of Sony, who I work for, or the CEO of Deutsche Bank, or so forth. That's like all they worry about. It's like they've delegated the worrying about employees. They've worried about the delegating of customers. But what are they left with? Worrying about what's going to clobber the economy and how are they going to fare. So it's almost like this whole question of what keeps you up at night as a CEO is also the size of the organization.
Yeah.
And they also have less ability to make change happen, because it's so complex.
That's correct.
And that's why so many consultants get hired to do change management. Whereas if you're a small business owner or CEO of 100 employees, it's much faster to make some changes. You just have to be sure you're making the right changes. What else can you think about that CEOs, what keeps CEOs up at night?
Well, so we touched on, I think the social issues that we're dealing with, right? And how to react to the social issues, and does the CEO get involved, and do they worry about an activist board member coming in? Carl Icahn just came in, and why am I drawing a blank? and he was pushing his agenda. I forgot.
Oh God, yeah, I can't remember what the situation was, but yeah.
But right there, he's basically saying, I want to put people on the board because I want to shift the mission of your company. And for the life of me, I can't understand why social issues are invading the boardroom. I understand social responsibility, which is without a doubt, but we're talking activism. So social responsibility, I want to just be clear. Social responsibility is one thing, and then activism is the other. And things that have happened even with Joe Rogan and Spotify is like all of a sudden the CEOs wait a minute, I just gave this guy $200 million. He brings me 11 million listeners a day. And what did he say? Why am I responsible for his content? Right. So they're not publishers. They're vehicles. They're TV.
Yeah, they're distribution vehicles, if you will.
And why? And wait a minute, I invested $200 million in this. And it's actually good for everyone's job over here. You employees that are complaining, or you board members. I mean, that's keeping people up at night. Where are you going to get hit from next? And why are you getting hit from them next?
Yeah, competition or disruptive competition certainly keeps a lot of, CEOs, again, of bigger businesses. It's hard for me. I mean, Amazon certainly disrupted and put tons of small booksellers out of business, and big ones too. But again, I think it's hard for a small business owner or CEO to see that thing coming. CEOs of bigger businesses, I've discovered, can see it, but they're like deer in the headlights because change is so hard. Xbox completely invaded PlayStation when I was at Sony, among other things. And Sony, there was no strategy to combat them because Microsoft had billions of dollars in cash to spend on the thing. And so they just spent their way to domination, and Sony couldn't keep up. And not that PlayStation has totally disappeared, but it's a shadow of itself from 20 years ago. It was, it defined the category for a long time, and then Xbox just blew it out of the water. But they saw it coming. They knew it was happening. And the difficulty to turn things around, especially when you are not a new CEO, like Gerstner was specifically brought in to turn IBM around. He didn't know much about IBM, but he knew about business. But I'm always amazed at small business people. It's very hard, I think, for them to take seriously something like a disruptive competitive threat or something, because I just find that they really don't talk a lot about what goes on outside of their company.
Oh, really?
That's been my experience. Yeah, they talk about it, but they don't know really what to do with that information. Is what I've discovered.
So I think, in those instances, you go back to the customer journey, right? So many CEOs today are looking at, or C-level people and boards are looking at customer experience, right? CX is a big thing. CX. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, you need to spend as much money and as much concern about customer journey.
Right.
Because if you don't know where you're going to touch people, the experience is, you don't know if you're putting the experience in the right spot. Mm-hmm. Where's the awareness starting? Where are you touching these people? And then you could worry about the experience, but worry about their experience of their full journey, from the awareness to the discovery to the selection process, mm-hmm. right? To the decision process, to the experience they have in fulfillment, and then to the aftercare. So, you have to follow up with your customers. You want that customer a second time, right? Where's the easiest customer is to expand what you own and to build upon what you've had. Mm-hmm. And if you're just worried about customer experience, you're losing out.
Well, because who delivers the customer experience? People. Whose people? Your employees.
Yeah.
One of the things, I had a client, very interesting. She was an accountant. I don't think she's listening in, but she was of Russian descent and was born in Russia. And she had a lot of Russian clients here in Brooklyn for accounting. And a lot of them are, not willing to accept the American way of doing things. Some of them are on the edge of being corrupt. And she decided she had to raise prices to sort of weed them out. Well, guess what? She kept rising her prices and they stayed. So great problem to have. But the real problem she had was she had terrible employees. Just she would take the bottom of the barrel. She had an awful looking space for something like an account. I mean, it looked like a warehouse. And so working with her, she bought a building that she then renovated. It was nice. And then finally she bit the bullet and started paying more for her employees, going to the better schools to get employees, recently graduated accountants. And suddenly her worries were all taken, because she was a worrier. She just constantly, bad clients, verging on potentially corrupt, bad employees who couldn't follow directions, couldn't follow any process. Everything was going crash and burn. And she solved it. And now she's moved to Miami. Her business is still in New York. And she's kind of like on call, but she's not like that deeply involved. And she's making a lot of money. So that's another way to look at it, is when you've gotten all your worries sorted out and you really have found the secret sauce, then I think you sleep better at night.
Oh,
in general. Yeah.
No question. And it also depends on what type of person you are. I'm very people centric and driven. So I want to make sure that I have a team, so that when I go out there, my first experience, or the customer's first experience with me is a positive one, because you have only one chance for a first experience, right? You have one chance to make your first impression, and you always want that. So when you build a business, or if you're working in a business, depending on where your focus is where you're going to go sleepless or not.
Yeah. I find I'm sleepless when I can't find the answer, when I can't figure to a problem. That's when I get, I get sleepless. I mean, I often have dreams. These days they're not so important. They're more like, what are we going to do about this webinar? But it keeps me up at night. Because if I don't know quite what the topic is or how we're going to structure it and things like that, that keeps me up at night. And when I was running a company, I think the employees kept me up at night, because if you're sued by an employee, you go through a lot of like, what did I do wrong? I had a situation where the lawsuit was completely frivolous. There was nothing documented, but he maintained that we owed him a broker's fee because he moved from Chicago to New York. Nowhere to be seen. My HR person had already left. And I was just like, where is this coming from? Whereas with customers, at least in consulting, you pretty much know why you are no longer there and or why you're there. But I found I was just getting, I would get flummoxed. I was still pretty young, but the whole employee lawsuit thing I understand how it happens and why it happens. But coming back to what we were talking about in terms of the social encroaching on it, it's because if you make a mistake there, one, you could be violating a law with protected classes, but two, an employee lawsuit, I find personally, is more distressing than losing a customer. Coming back to the question I asked 10 or 15 minutes ago. And again, I'm just thinking back through all the things I did. I spent a lot of time worrying that we were fulfilling customer needs. But the answer always was, as you said, listen to the customer. If you really listen to the customer, they will give you the answers. Whereas you can listen to the employees as much as you want, and they still do stuff that you wonder, why are they doing this? Why am I being lost? Why is the project not getting done? Why do I have this feeling that this guy or gal is toxic and not really speaking well of anyone, without putting my finger on it?
Yeah, it's actually funny, because I've had hundreds of people work for me, and I don't think I've ever really worried, sleepless. but I've worried sleepless about where the next order's coming from.
Ah, interesting.
Right. And so it's like, okay, am I going to, I go by the theory, if you build it, they will come. So if you build it, then
Right.
coming to me is like, okay, are they coming? Are they coming? Are they coming?
Right. And I think this is where the maxim of fail often and fail fast comes from. You can do that pretty well with customers and products, because if you plan it out and know where your milestones are, you can tell if you're going to run into problems. And I think that's true of employees too. But I think it takes my experience has been, it's harder for CEOs to learn the story of good employees. How do I find them? How do I retain them, especially in a talent war? The product side, as I said, a startup, when you go bust because the product's not there or it's terrible or you've misjudged it, you'll learn that pretty fast.
Yeah, you learn it really quick.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really have a choice. When you're not making money, you're not being successful. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I know we only had an hour, or we have an hour. We have a couple more minutes left. Anything else you want to add to the conversation?
No, I think we've determined that it really, what keeps you up, what keeps the CEO up is probably more a myriad of things than one or the other. Because if you come in as a CEO and you're a people person and you create a culture that's amenable to your team, you're going to have no problems with your team and you're going to worry about your clients. And the other way is if you're the kind of guy who, the CEO that comes with a product and then brings people to help, that you might worry about your team.
Yeah.
So,
I agree actually 100% on that. Those of my clients who had trouble with their teams were highly product focused, or in one case, this is also interesting. I don't know. He didn't worry about his employees enough to the point where he was making some very bad decisions because he didn't want to be that kind of boss, i.e. fire the weakest links, keep the high performers happy. It was like all one. And it completely fell apart on him. I mean, totally. And I told him it would, and it did, because his high performers started leaving. Right. So he's an example of someone who didn't worry enough about it. And he worried about his customers. So I guess my bottom line is empirical evidence is showing that those who no longer worry about their customers means they have something in place that allows them not to. But the employee thing, I frankly think it never ends. It's just when you think you've figured out the employees, something weird happens. So your best performer goes to a competitor. Your right hand guy, the guy who knows all the secrets, decides to retire, or has an accident, or they just do weird things that you just can't even put your finger on why they're doing that, and that can be toxic. I find that one, you almost can have a recipe book for the customers and the products and the experience, but when it comes to employees, it's amazing still what goes wrong, even when you think you figured it all out.
Yeah, there's an interesting, you're bringing something up that's interesting, is that the employees are people and the customers are businesses. Now they're people too. So right. I don't want to, but basically you're dealing with more of a entity.
Right.
When you're
in a B2B world. Now in a B2C world, it's also different because you probably have hundreds of thousands of customers as opposed to B2B where you may have 5 organizations.
Right. That's exactly.
Yeah, that's actually, we didn't talk about that difference between B2B and B2C. In B2B, I've known consulting companies that have relied on one big customer. Well, guess what happens when that customer decides they just don't need so many consultants? There's always that moment when consultants get thrown out, and that's your biggest client. Well, something tells me you should have worried more about your customer base than you did.
Right, exactly. No, the old 80-20 rule, right? You have to be careful.
Yeah, well, and you have to, I think the way I'd like to end today's session is talk a little bit about the wise man, the sage, the thing that takes you to the higher level. At some point, you'll learn a lot of the rules, but you'll also learn it's only about people. Everything is about people. And if you can't hook into that very important aspect, empathy, which is knowing how somebody feels, understanding your client, understanding your people. And, there's not for nothing that most of the successful CEOs that I've met have been amazingly intelligent, insightful, and warm people. It's the EQ. It's coming back to this, the EQ. So I think that goes for customers, that goes for employees, that goes for all the, your shareholders, your board. If you can't feel your way into what's going on from a people point of view, you're going to run into trouble in any front.
Yeah, no, it's funny because there was someone brought that up again earlier this week, that it was compassion, not empathy, and I actually thought that there's an interesting distinction. I don't know if you want to be compassionate as much as empathetic.
I think we talked about. I had the same conversation. Wasn't you and I?
No,
it was the same conversation.
But it's the empathy is super hyper important. I guess compassion is within empathy, but compassion alone, I don't think is a two-way street.
It also can be, the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And in my worst days, I would say, sorry, we're a business, we're not a charity. My other thing is, I love one of my topics, one of these days, maybe we'll talk about it next time, is tolerance. We think the opposite of tolerance in the workplace is intolerant. No, that's not what it is. Tolerance means you let things slip. You don't really keep the discipline, the good habits. You let people get away with things. So the opposite is, well, there could be many opposites. In my world, it's carefrontation, that you actually always address an issue as fast as you see it. And they're usually always people issues. So there's, definitely a lot to be said for business gets skewered a lot in the media because we seem not compassionate. But what they don't understand is it's not that we're not being compassionate. It's just that there are certain things that are more important than being compassionate. Discipline, good habits, and so forth. And that can make some people look like taskmasters if they don't do it quite right. But empathy is your ability to understand how someone's feeling, not necessarily to give in to that or to show pity or compassion.
No, you can show compassion and empathy.
In necessary, but empathy itself, literally, the definition is to understand how someone's feeling, how you react to that person and what they're feeling. Yeah, in many cases, compassion is very important, but it can't be the overall way of handling situations. It's got to be, that's just the wise man. The wise man says, you got to look at what the truth is. Truth is that employee may not suit here. They've got all these issues. They're not fitting into the culture. Likewise, Accenture, I learned as Accenture, you can have really bad clients. And what do you do with bad clients? You get rid of them. If you're really smart, you get rid of the bad clients because it drags you down.
No, you're only as good as your lowest, right? Or your worst component.
Yeah, exactly. The weakest link. So in one phrase or one or two phrases, how would you summarize where we landed?
We landed that it's sort of what keeps you up at night is what you're not best at.
Mm-hmm.
If you're best at people, then you don't worry about your employees. And if you're best at product or services, you don't worry about your customers, because that's the pixie dust is placed on one of the two sides of the equation. Mm-hmm. And what really keeps CEOs up at night more is the societies we're seeing it evolve today is probably the bigger answer. The pandemic, the war, the lack of the basic fundamental rights of humanity that we've been used to since the Magna Carta.
Mm-hmm. So my answer would be, it depends on where you are in your development as a leader in the organization. As a startup, you're going to obsess about competitors, not competitors, but about your customers and the product. Absolutely, you're going to obsess. But you have got to learn quickly that, especially if you have success in the marketplace, you better start getting the right employees in. And because for that's for many people get the product side, CEOs or business owners who get the product side right up front, that becomes like a black box. So, and when they become good at, when they've now found a head of marketing, head of sales, and so forth, and can get the customer side under control, then they're going to worry about employees. And then when they've got the employee thing down with good HR people and good managers and so forth, that's when they have to start really worrying about all this exogenous factors.
Yeah.
So that would be my answer, is that it starts with the worrying about customers, middle is worry about employees, at the end, again, if you've really grown. Of course, I think Jeff Bezos never seems to worry about anything, but he's very involved on the world stage. So that's, I don't know if he worries, but that's what he's most involved in.
So it's for you, it's fluid. You have a fluidity depending on your stage of business.
Yeah, and your own development as a CEO and so forth. You can still, you can have a company that's 15 years old and still be acting like a startup. And you can start up and hit it right and suddenly have $100 million in revenue in the first or second year, and then you're not really a startup. So it has a lot to do with the CEO's own trajectory and learning curve.
Yep. Hopefully, if you do that, you bring in someone who's run $100 million companies.
And who fits with your culture and who you like to work with and so forth. But as usual, it's been great. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
It looks like we're going to be doing the last Thursday of every month. So hopefully we'll keep this routine going, find another interesting, provocative conversation to have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.